Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Taylor Clem with UF IFAS Extension Nassau County. I'm the horticulture agent and county extension director, and I am joined today by one of our master gardener volunteers, Shirley Lohman. And today we're going to talk all about gardens and the roses that we can grow within them in Florida. So feel free at any time to send us any questions, comments, through the chat box. We're monitoring that. But when we think about roses, oh, actually, I don't want to get ahead of myself. So hold on. So I want to start off, let's dispel a myth. So finish this line. Every rose has its what? Put it into the chat box. Every rose has its what? Yeah. So I know who our poison fans are. So yeah, there's the if you're probably a lot of you may know the 80s song, Every Rose Has Its Thorn. I'm seeing some really good responses in here. Every rose has its flower, its needs. I like that. It's heyday. That's a good one. So every rose has its flower, its spine, its thorns. But yeah, so every rose has its thorn. Black spot. Yeah, we'll talk about black spot, Vicki. So every rose has its thorn. So I went and I asked two experts in this subject matter. On the left, you're going to see a botanist, Mark Frank. He's with the University of Florida Herbarium at the museum, Natural History Museum, the Herbarium. He's oversees it. He's a botanist. And on the right, that is Bret Michaels. He's the singer-songwriter for the 80s band Poison. And he actually wrote the song, Every Rose Has Its Thorn. So I asked both of them, what are your responses? And then this is what they said. So Mark Frank said prickle. And Bret Michaels said thorn. So in actuality, despite the song Every Rose Has Its Thorn, it's not correct. That's not botanically correct. So every time I hear that song, I'm like, oh, Bret Michaels is obviously not a botanist or a plant geek. So, but technically the appropriate term is prickle. So when we actually talk about, just from the botany perspective, what is a prickle? What is a thorn? What is a spine? So there are technical definitions, and every rose has its prickle is the most appropriate phrase. But a prickle is any sharp outgrowth from the epidermis or bark of a flower, a plant, a tree, a shrub. Roses are not the only plants that have prickles. Like a Hercules club, technically, silk moss tree has really creepy looking prickles all over it. So they're sharp outgrowth from the epidermis or bark. Whereas a thorn, which is labeled A on the image at the bottom, it's a stiff woody, it's a modified stem. And they only come out at those nodes on the branches of plants. So the nodes where like a leaf or a flower bud may emerge, that is a node. So you're going to have it is technically a modified stem, and they only appear at those sections or those places. Whereas a spine is not a modified stem, but it's a modified leaf. So a great example of a modified leaf, and we're talking about spines, are like cacti. So those cacti, all those little spines that grow on them, those, because of the cacti themselves being able to like photosynthesize from the pads of the cacti, they then, rather than having the leaves, they developed those prickles. Evolutionarily, they developed those spines in lieu of those leaves. So there's a lot of great examples, but from the botanical perspective, roses have prickles because they develop those sharp outgrowths along the epidermis and bark. Some days you'll have a few prickles, and there might be some days on your roses where sometimes you'll see that they develop a lot more prickles along the branches. So, but anyways, so I want us to talk about what interests you in roses? So there's a lot of different roses that we can grow and use in our gardens, but what interests you the most about roses? Go ahead and put that in the chat box. Shirley, what do you like most about roses?
Probably, well, of course, the beauty of the flower, but the scent of the old, especially the older roses, is delightful in the garden.
Yeah, so like the old garden roses have a little bit more fragrance to them, and I'm seeing the beauty and color, the fragrance. Oh, that's a neat one. So it's like someone's mother grew them. So because their mother grew them, they have a whole other different type of attachment to them besides just that aesthetic quality. Nice. They can have long lasting color. Yeah. Some of those modern roses, you can pretty much have them bloom all throughout the growing season, which is really, really cool. Yeah. Some of the old garden roses, I think, are just going to bloom maybe once, and they could be for a short period. Oh, yeah. And you can get some really cool color variations. We'll talk a little bit about those. So a train's coming by, so I apologize. I'm in Yuli's office today, but I'm going to circle something right back here. Can you all see that circle that is put on the screen? So one thing I was thinking about roses is there's a tremendous variety, and one of the reasons that I do like them, I sometimes have I joke that I have a love-hate relationship with roses. They're beautiful, beautiful plants. But I used to work at Kentucky Botanical Gardens, which is in Lexington, Kentucky, and this is an aerial of the gardens. And what I circled is the rose garden. So I would have to go out there and prune and groom the canes and the roses all the time throughout the year, and I would get pricked and stabbed and poked, but my goodness, it was beautiful. We had climbing roses. We probably had 100 to 200 different rose varieties out there that were growing. So when I think about roses, they're unbelievably beautiful plants. They're fragrant, they're sweet, but then it's like, oh, sometimes when you have a lot of them to maintain, sometimes I have flashbacks, but those were supposed to be like the really high maintenance roses in that area compared to some of the other low maintenance roses, which we had in different parts of the garden. So roses have, I think, a really unique perspective that everybody gets. Like the things that we like about them. I know we mentioned the blooms, the scents. But also one individual mentioned that their mother used to grow them. So they have a certain symbolic representation to them. It's Valentine's Day. So when we think about Valentine's Day, we think about maybe like a red rose. My wife doesn't like roses, so I don't buy them for her. I buy her tulips and daylilies. Those are her favorites. But anyways, so, the roses have a really cool symbolic history, not just in modern gardens, but I mean, roses have been around, used within gardens for, oh boy, 300 years, 400 years. So it's a really neat thing to kind of talk about because of their history and past, and the interest that we have is pretty diverse. So let's go ahead and talk about what our essential questions are for today's program. The first one is, which roses do best in Florida's environment? So we're going to talk about that because that's important, because Florida, we're a little tricky. And a lot of us probably know that if you recently moved to Florida, you've learned that Florida is a whole other bag of worms or can of worms when it comes to learning how to garden. Or just as you've been gardening here over the past few years of your experience gardening, that there are some different tips and tricks that you need to follow because of our climate conditions. So we're going to really talk about which roses do best in Florida's environment. So we're going to talk about the history and selection, but then we're going to talk a bit about how do you actually manage roses. So by the end of this program, you should be able to answer these questions pretty comfortably. So let's talk about rose classifications. So, there's a National Rose Society, and there's a bunch of different chapters throughout the country, and they have a basic classifications of roses. And this is this is globally standardized pretty much. So looking at the classifications, we have kind of like three broad classifications. There's the species, which is predominantly they are the wild roses, just those natural native type roses that are they're not managed, they weren't cultivated or for that original kind of like form, color, shape, whatever. But within we have the old garden roses. The old garden roses are traditionally these pre-1867. That's a pretty hard date. Pre-1867, those are a lot of those traditional roses. And then after 1867, we have a modern rose. So the old garden roses to modern rose, that's where we have hundreds of varieties of different types of roses that we can have within our gardens. And people are constantly breeding them, changing them, developing new cultivars or varieties. So that's what makes roses so diverse. But the reason that we have that 1867 is kind of that first big development in a new hybrid tea type of rose. And that is called the La France or La Franc rose. And that's an image on the right. That is that first rose variety that was developed. And it was developed in 1867. And that is considered that point between that old garden rose and modern rose. So it's kind of a neat little period in which how we classify just roses. But in each one of these areas, like the species, old garden roses and modern roses, there's like subclasses that are filled in there. And in modern rose classes, those subclasses, we have things like the hybrid tea and grandiflora. Those are the two most common modern rose subclasses that we see in our gardens globally, nationwide. But the next behind that is the Floribunda and Polyantha. So I have put a little asterisk next to Floribunda because that's going to be important one that we're going to talk about, because Floribunda roses, or at least Floribunda rootstock, is the most important, or it's the rose that does best in Florida. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But the Floribunda and Polyantha, but then we also have some like miniature or miniflora type of modern roses. And then there's the shrub subclass, and that kind of includes some of the old garden roses as well. But then we also have some like climbers as well. So climbing roses, which we have some that can do pretty well in Florida. So these are these rose classifications, but we're going to kind of focus predominantly on that. Looking more at that old garden roses and modern roses, but we'll put an emphasis on that Floribunda here momentarily. So when we look at those rose types, so that old garden rose and modern rose, so those highly cultivated and selected varieties, we have kind of like, we break them down into two different classifications. There's like a low maintenance and high maintenance. We prefer the low maintenance. If you have a Florida friendly landscape, you're going to have to pick a low maintenance rose. Because the high maintenance roses, the amount of grooming, the amount of insecticides, fungicides that you put into those to help them stay happy and healthy in the landscape doesn't technically fall within a Florida friendly landscape. Now, of course, if you have one or two that you like to maintain for show purposes, absolutely. But when we're trying to select good, strong roses that can do well in our landscape that are low maintenance, some of those that we're going to pick include the Louis Philippe, the Mutabilis, the Mrs. B. Arcant, Spice, the knockout or drift roses. Those are super common. You can find those at pretty much any big box store now. Another example is the Cinco de Mayo, which is a type of Floribunda. And Shirley, if I remember correctly, you have a Cinco de Mayo, is that correct?
Right. And other than water and fertilize, it doesn't get sprayed with anything, pesticides, fungicides, nothing. And it's in bloom right now.
Oh, wonderful. And you're getting those big clusters of flowers. They're not necessarily solitary flowers. And that is a good, cool characteristic of the Floribunda roses as well, is that they were bred to kind of have more clumps or groupings of flowers. And
the fragrance is really nice.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful flower cluster, at least on here. So, and I know that yours probably surely look just as good or even better.
Well, not right now, but in a few months they will.
We'll get there. Yeah. So these are our low maintenance types. And in Florida, we actually are kind of limited on the low maintenance types of roses because of our environmental conditions. But here's some of the other pictures of those roses that we can grow. So the mutabilis, that's actually really closely related. That's an old garden rose, but it actually is very closely related to kind of just like those species-based roses. And the neat thing about those mutabilis is it comes like yellows, a pink, kind of like a creamy mix of the two. You can have some of the roses that are multiple colors. So you'll have multiple colors on one shrub, but one flower in itself could be multiple colors. So it's really neat. The mutabilis, which is an old garden rose. The Mrs. B.R. Cant, that's a hybrid tea. And I really like that one because I really like chrysanthemums. I'm sorry, not chrysanthemums. I mean, I do like those, but I really like camellias, and I really like double bloom camellias. And I really like this BR Cant because it has a much tighter bloom than some of the other roses. And I read that the BR Cant can have up to 60 to 80 little oh no, what's the name that's skipping me? Shirley, petals. I couldn't remember petals. So I was laughing. So if like you're on Valentine's Day and you're doing the she loves me not, she loves me, you'll be there for a while. So but the Louis Philippe rose, which is an old garden rose, and as well as a spice rose, which is another old garden rose. But so those are some of those really common ones that do really, really well, just as is, throw them in the ground, they'll be successful. But when we're talking about site selection and preparation, roses, those environmental conditions are pretty consistent for all of them. It doesn't matter. They need about 6 to 8 hours of full sun. If you do have it in a part shade condition or environment, you need to make sure that it gets the morning sun. It needs that morning sun. And a lot of that has to do with predominantly moisture control, which we'll talk about. Roses don't like competition. So don't put them too close together because they'll start fighting with one another, or they'll be fighting against other plants around them for nutrients. They have poor salt tolerance. So you just got to be careful, especially if you're living along the marsh or the coastal area in Nassau County. But nonetheless, as long as we're not having like your yard's not flooding, they should be all right. So they do prefer slightly acidic soils. So you can do a pH test within our office. If you want to bring soil samples by, we can do those pH tests, and we can kind of determine what type of amendments are needed to help decrease your soil pH. But they also need well-drained soils, but they don't want it to be bone dry. They still need to be able to hold on to that. You still need a soil that can help hold on to a little bit of that moisture, and it helps hold on to those nutrients, because nutrient management for roses is really, really important. Yes, ma'am.
My roses defy all of those requirements. Every single one.
Are they deep shade? They live in brackish water.
They're near the salt water. They don't get 6 hours of sun. They're planted in the garden with all the other plants. I have alkaline soil. I do have well-drained soil, but it doesn't hold moisture and nutrients. Mm-hmm. So you can still grow some of these.
And for the low maintenance ones, yes, I think that they are more adaptable than those high maintenance ones. You have to make sure they're in very specific conditions.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The high maintenance will pout otherwise. But
yeah,
they're pretty much, they're going to take care of themselves.
Yeah, and moisture control, which we're about to talk about, is going to be key to their success. And another Floribunda variety that I really, really like is this Burgundy Iceberg. And I really like it because that burgundy color can get so dark that it almost can look black because it's such a dark burgundy color. I actually knew somebody that was able to breed selectively from a Burgundy Iceberg and was able to get actually black flowers, rose flowers, through selective breeding, which included a Burgundy Iceberg. So, which was kind of neat. So site preparation. So we talked about those environmental conditions. If the soil is well drained, and it's just straight sand, and like in some areas it is, some areas is not, but if you do have a really well drained soil, it can be really nice to take about 2 to 4 inches of organic matter and till it in to the top 12 inches of the planting area if you don't have really good organic matter. If you have a good organic matter buildup in your soil, then you shouldn't have to do a soil amendments. But some of those amendments that we can use in our garden include like peat moss, manure, or just composted manure or any other type of compost. That's a really great way that you just kind of spread that in and then till it in. And it's not just where that root zone or where that root ball is going to be when you're planting your roses. You got to think about that whole rose bed where the roses are going to be, because roses are really good at shooting their roots out and filling up a space with the root mass very quickly. So in order to help with soil moisture and soil nutrient holding capacity, making sure that you're amending that whole area where the beds will help make sure that your roses are successful. If you do have a really like a poorly drained soil, you can till in sand actually into the top 12 inches to help increase drainage. Or if that's not successful, I mean, you can always plant them in containers or raised beds. You can actually get the rose root stock, and you can just plant those actually in like little mounds of pine bark mulch and kind of like a peat moss mix, and it works great as well. So there's different strategies that you can plant these, but it ultimately comes back to your drainage. If it is really well drained, you can till in organic matter, but if it's poorly drained, you can till in some sand in that top 12 inches. So yeah, there's one question that we have is like clay. So clay is going to be poorly drained. Well, the higher clay content you have, that means the lower your drainage comes. A good soil actually does have clay within it. So if your soil is not draining well because you have a high clay content, it could be worth tilling in that sand, and that can help. But because I know kind of like geographically where this question is coming from, you might have to build up a little bit, because even if you go down beyond 12 inches, you're going to have potentially very poor drainage. And that's kind of one of the drawbacks. I know on the west side of the county, in Nassau County, we do have areas of poor drainage and higher clay content. So containers or raised beds can always work out best, especially for those higher maintenance roses if you want them. So talk about planting roses. So the planting date is typically going to be in early spring. So you can plant them. Usually if you haven't planted them yet, it's going to be best to wait until after our last frost. So that's usually beginning mid to mid-March, around March 15th is kind of where our last frost average is. So usually waiting until after that frost is going to be best, because you don't want to put them in the ground and you start to get new growth, because then that frost will kill that new growth and it'll start to take away some of that stored energy within the plant. So it can make it harder for it to establish, and it could potentially end up dying in the landscape before it can actually be productive. So there are some options of planting your roses. So there is bare root and container. So you can go to the store and you can just buy bare root roses, and the bare root roses are nice, but they can be a little bit more challenging. So I actually prefer containers. If you have a lot of experience with roses, by all means try the bare root, but I would recommend making sure that you get containers. And a lot of that has to do with that root stock. So a lot of our roses that we buy commercially are grafted. So we'll have a root stock and we'll have the actual scion, which is what's growing up above the ground. And actually the actual name of that root stock that we use is the Fortunia. And that is the root stock that ends up doing best really well in Florida. So it's best to buy containers because more than likely a lot of those containers are going to have that Fortunia rootstock, which is going to be really nice. Other bare roots may not have that, so you could plant them in our ground, but they may not be as successful. So, but anyways, so preferably container is going to be best for if you have the ability to find them. But anyways, give slightly more space to grow than usual than for most roses, because roses actually can, if they're healthy in the landscape, they can fill out a space much more than maybe some other places throughout the United States. It can actually get pretty large. So like the old garden roses, we use the term sleep, creep, and leap because they don't look like they do much for the first couple years, but that's just because they are growing their roots. They're focusing on root development and pushing them out in the soil to help so they can get additional moisture and nutrient uptake. And then one day, bam, they just really start growing and taking off. So we use that term sleep, creep, and leap because they start taking over and filling up a space pretty quickly once they start growing. So just plan for that extra space for them and don't plant them too tightly or close together within the landscape. Let's see. Okay, so with the containers, when you look at the roses, you can actually see where it might be swelling a little bit at the base. And that's where that graft has taken place. That is the rootstock and the scion. So they swell up a little bit at the base of those roses. So when you go to plant your roses, make sure that you keep that above the ground. Because if that's below the ground at all, that's going to end up with excess of moisture. It can rot and it can impact that graft and it could kill the scion. So the best thing to consider is planting your rose at the same depth that it is within the container. So that soil line in the container, put that at the same level in your landscape. I know sometimes we say plant a little higher. Some rare occasions we say plant deeper, but just plant at the same level as the container within your landscapes. So, and then you're going to irrigate frequently for about 6 weeks to help them get established. And you can pull back that irrigation. And then roses, a lot of our low maintenance roses are very drought tolerant. And you rarely have to really water them. But nonetheless, that establishment period, that frequent irrigation is going to be needed for the first 6 weeks, no matter which type of rose that you're going to put in the ground. And then some of our roses, depending on the size of them, you may have to anchor them. So anchor them as needed. You can get like a metal pipe or anything like that to help give it structure and support so the roots can establish and it doesn't get toppled over. So now we're going to talk about rose maintenance. So we learned about kind of like some of those good cultivars or those varieties of roses that we can grow. We learned about site selection, preparation, and planting. So now your roses are in the ground. Let's kind of talk about that rose maintenance. So breaking up rose maintenance, we're going to look at irrigation, fertilization, mulching, weeding, grooming, and then pruning. So grooming and pruning are kind of similar, but they do have key differences. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what these images that you see here. So irrigation. So roses do not like moisture. They need the water to help grow, but any water that stays on their leaves, any water, even it's rain or dew or whichever, because of our high humidity and because of our temperatures, roses are susceptible to fungal pathogens. So black spot, powdery mildew, Cercospora, those are all 3 key fungi pathogens that impact our roses, and black spot is a really bad one that will pretty much kill your roses. So you have to have constant control over water to prevent fungal outbreaks or fungal pathogens within your roses. So irrigation is key because the roses need the water, but you got to be careful in how you're applying that water as well. So the best is to use micro irrigation. Micro irrigation, whether it be drip lines or drip sprays, like kind of what you see in this image, what that does is that slowly allows that water to just percolate out and get in the root zone of the roses where the water is needed. The leaves don't need the water. So it allows you to use water more efficiently by putting that water right on the root zone. And this goes for all your ornamental plants, not just your roses, but using that micro irrigation really helps control where the water is going to go. And that can help prevent and avoid fungal outbreaks or fungal pathogens from getting into your roses. If you do have rotors, so pop-up rotors that are spraying and throwing water, irrigate in the morning, only in the morning, because then you need to make sure that that morning sun can dry up any excess moisture on the leaves. So that kind of goes back that if you're growing in part shade, make sure they have good morning sun, because if you do have that morning sun, that can help get that moisture off of the leaves. So then the longer that water sits on the leaves, the higher chance you're going to start developing a fungal pathogen on those leaves. And some of them can get down in the soil and they'll stay there for a while. So the frequency of irrigation. So our low maintenance roses, kind of like knockouts, you really, just as needed. So like knockout roses are great, tough shrubbing roses that are dwarf varieties that you can go buy. Once they're established, irrigate as needed. Some higher maintenance roses, a minimum of once a week past that establishment phase. So now let's talk about fertilization. So fertilization is kind of one of the most frequent things that you have to do with a lot of our rose species or rose varieties. So I recommend just selecting a rose specific fertilizers because it does have the micronutrients, the correct levels of micro and macronutrients that are work best for roses, and then make sure that it is slow release. There's a lot of rose fertilizers that you can get that are water soluble that you spray on, but a lot of those nutrients leave the soil very, very quickly, so you're not using it as effectively or as efficiently. So make sure you can get a very specific rose-specific fertilizer that has those micronutrients and is slow release. So it's going to be granular, kind of like what you see in this picture. It's not going to be a liquid form. And you can find a slow release rose fertilizer at pretty much any big box store. Now you could theoretically side dress with just any general slow release fertilizer. And you can always come back with, if you needed to, you can do special applications of micronutrients to help with deficiencies. But getting rose specific fertilizers can make it a little simpler. But for roses, you want to fertilize monthly. So mid-February to mid-November, I usually remember that the first time that we're going to fertilize our roses is Valentine's Day. So Valentine's Day is always a good reminder. It's time to start my fertilization schedule for the year. So that's kind of like right at the beginning of their growing season and goes right to the end of their growing season. You're doing it monthly. So you do about 1 cup per shrub. Or if they're smaller shrubs, what you can do is bi-monthly. So you just do 2 applications a month, but you're just splitting it up as a half a cup. But again, it's kind of that same amount as you go each month. Spoon, like very small plants are established that you're just putting in the landscape, you can spoon feed them even less, but you might end up having to do, excuse me, you might have to do it just a little bit more frequently, but you're literally just spoon feeding them. You're not giving them much at all, not even that half cap. But even a lot of our low maintenance roses, you may not have to. You can kind of fertilize them as needed. Like knockout roses are really good. Drift roses, they don't require the regular fertilizer per month. They could probably get by with like once or twice a year. Pretty simple. Shirley, are you doing once a month on your roses, or are you just kind of just doing like a couple times a year?
Yeah, I try to do it once a month, but it's more like a couple times a year.
Yeah. So
maybe 3 or 4 if I'm really diligent.
But that's good to know because I mean your roses look really good. So then you're not necessarily hitting it every single month, but you're still being successful within your landscape. So that's nice. So the once a month is kind of the general recommendation, but if you miss a month, that's okay. Your low maintenance roses will definitely forgive you and still look wonderful. So next is the mulching and weeding. So mulch applying mulch has a great impact on our landscapes, not just roses, but applying 2 to 3 inches of mulch and replacing mulch as needed is very beneficial for our landscapes because they can help with soil moisture retention. They can help with weed suppression. They can help keep the soil at a moderate temperature so the soil is not getting too hot. So there's a lot of benefits to having good mulch within our landscape. It can be like pine bark, pine needles, eucalyptus, melaleuca, any of your leaf litter or anything like that within your landscape that you can use for mulch works wonderful. So one of the biggest and best things about this mulching is black spot. You could end up getting black spot, and we'll talk about that on your roses. So you can pick up as much of your leaves as possible, but then each year after you try to remove as much of the leaves, if you have black spot, you can come back and you put a little extra mulch or top dress with mulch, and that actually helps prevent any of the black spot fungus that's on the ground to get back up on the roses. So making sure that you're replacing mulch as needed can actually help control some of the spread of fungal pathogens, but it also has great other benefits within our landscapes. And any type of weeds that do pop up, highly recommend just manually remove weeds because roses can be a little finicky. So herbicides will damage your roses if you're not applying them appropriately. So now let's talk about grooming. So your rose, you planted it, you learned about fertilization and you learned about watering, irrigation, and mulch. Now let's talk about grooming. So you have to take care of your roses. So there's different ways or different strategies or things that we need to do on a regular basis to help promote a healthy plant. So the trimming of the plants, as part of this grooming can help improve the overall health. It can help maintain a well-shaped rose. It can help with the overall productivity of the plant. So that essentially means that your rose will have more prolific blooming and it can extend its bloom period. So the more grooming you do, the better roses that you have. So those high maintenance roses, you're grooming them all the time to make sure that they are as productive and the best flowers that they can be. So if you're showing roses, you're going to be doing grooming on a very regular basis. If you're doing showing roses, or if you're doing cut rows for to sell, etc. So the more grooming, the better. But of course, low maintenance roses, you don't have to do it as much, but it's still significant. There's still significant benefit for doing that grooming. But the grooming is dependent on your expectations. If the rose looks good, cool, don't do too much, but if you want it to look even better, you might have to do more grooming to help encourage that development of it. But nonetheless, there are 3 major points that what we can do as part of our grooming process that you're doing on a regular basis to help with that health, that shape, and that productivity of the rose. The first one is deadheading. Deadheading and removing any of the spent flowers in the landscape or on the roses can help, you get rid of it, and that plant, the rose, can then start to develop and flower again through the growing season. So it can help do multiple flower rotations or extend that flowering period for a lot of those low maintenance roses, which is really, really nice. So deadhead. Remove any suckers. So suckers are going to be any of those little branches that are coming up from the bottom of the rose. So more than likely, those suckers are coming from the rootstock, and we don't want the rootstock to be putting nutrients into what it's growing. We want that rootstock to purely go into the scions. So it's going to, everything that you obviously want to flower. We see this a lot with citrus trees. If you don't remove your suckers, one day you're going to have sour oranges on your citrus tree. But make sure that you prune any suckers or remove them as soon as you see them. So that's going to be regular maintenance throughout the year. So then the rose can focus on putting that water and nutrients up into the scion, or that upper part of the rose. That is why you planted it. So remove any suckers, and then stem removal. If there's any crossing stems that are rubbing against one another, or if there's any stems that you see running through the middle of the the shrub, go ahead and prune those out because those are not going to be productive. As well as if you see any dead branching stems, etc., go ahead and remove those. So now let's talk about pruning. So grooming is kind of the things that you do throughout the year. Pruning, we're going to talk about, is kind of more of a once a year. It prepares your roses for the spring. And this is what you can do. You don't necessarily have to do this as intensively with the low maintenance roses, but with all of our roses, if you do this, it's going to help with that production and that flowering and growth of the roses for that season. So the best time to prune our roses are, well, right now, starting, mid-February to early March. So we're creeping up on that pruning date. You know, I prefer making sure that you have bypass blade shears, like pruning shears that have a bypass blade. You can use a lopper or a folding saw. Usually I just use my pruning shears. That's always been effective. Then a couple times I have to use a lopper to get some big canes out of roses when I'm trimming them. So those are the tools. And also, like, you have your normal garden gloves. If you have gauntlets, the ones that go all the way up to your elbows, I would recommend those. If you have just a couple roses, don't go out and get those. But if you're managing a lot of roses, go get those. Your body will thank you for them. So when you're doing pruning, I always like to say there's two kind of stages. There's the pruning prep stage, and then there's the actual pruning. So the pruning prep is, okay, you're going to go out to your shrub. It's that pruning time. Just go ahead and remove any dead wood. Any dead wood, just cut it back. Remove it. Remove any thin or weak growth. Prune it out. Get rid of it. Remove any crossing canes. So those are any canes or branches that are shooting through the rose bush, because those are taking a lot of energy and nutrients, and they're not going to be they're not going to be productive. So remove those. And then any leaves, actually, if you have any leaves that are still on your plant, you can actually go ahead and remove them. Just take them all off the plant, rake any leaves up off of the ground, dispose of them. We actually have one EDIS publication that says burn them. Throw them in a fire if you have them, but you can just throw them in your trash and throw them out that way. And the reason we do that is because you're about to get a lot of new growth, and any fungus that's still within those leaves on the plant or on the ground, that helps get them out of the landscape. So go ahead and remove dead wood, remove thin and weak growth, remove crossing canes, and then remove all leaves from rows and ground and dispose of them. So then we actually think, okay, pruning. Now we are at the point where you kind of just have like branches. You don't have too many crazy things. It might be tall, and now you're trying to look at, like, how do I prune this to kind of get to the height that I want it to be? So the best thing to think about when you're actually doing your major pruning cuts now is you're shaping your rows. So it's easy to tell which direction your roses are going to bloom or grow, because we have what are called bud eyes. Bud eyes are what's in those little squares on this image, and that's where the leaves or the branching are going to start coming out of that cane, of that rose. So what I say is prune down to an outward facing bud eye. So a bud eye that's pointing away from the center of the plant, because then that's going to make the rose start to grow more round and circular. So you have a much fuller, because you don't want the bud eyes to grow inwards, because then all of a sudden you're going to have a plant, all the branches are fighting against one another. So you want to prune down to a bud eye that's facing outwards. So you just go and prune down all the canes to the height that you want to that outward facing bud eye. And that'll encourage that round growth. And then that height is ultimately up to you. If you want a taller rose, go for it. If you want a little bit more compact, go down to those lower bud eyes. So it's really nice if you have multiple layers of roses. The roses that are in the back of like a rose hedge, you might prune higher, and then the ones that are lower, you might have smaller cultivars, but you can also, or varieties, but then you can prune them a little bit lower as well. So then you can really make sure that you see your roses. So that's gonna be those big things, is cutting. So look for those bud eyes. Those bud eyes on the brown branches are really pronounced. You can see them. And oh, great question. How far above do we cut or prune above the bud eyes? About 1/4 of an inch. And you want to do it about a 45-degree angle. And usually the recommendation, if you don't, that's fine, it's not the end of the world, but to help prevent water from getting onto that bud eye. So say this is your bud eye on your branch, you have the cut slope away from the bud eye. So any moisture goes away from the bud eye. Whereas if you accidentally cut towards the bud eye, any water that lands on the branch will come right into that bud eye. So just a 45-degree cut and about 1/4 of an inch right above the bud eye. Don't whip out a ruler to go, measure it, but as long as it's a good, nice, clean cut and it's outward facing bud, you should be fine. And it'll be totally all right. So if it's a straight flat cut across a 90-degree cut, right across the branch, that's fine. It's not the end of the world. The rose is going to be fine. But a 45-degree helps just get moisture away from the plant, and about 1/4 of an inch above that bud eye. So, but anyways, great question. So there are climbing rose specifics. So if you do have climbing roses that you're training up on trellises, the best thing to remember is don't cut those main canes. Now you can, if they're getting too long, you can trim them back, but the flowering and leafing out is actually going to be occurring on those lateral branches. So the lateral branching, those are where you're going to prune and trim. And because that's going to encourage that growth and that flowering on that climbing vine. And with pruning, with climbing roses, you can think about the bud eyes, but it's not as important as the shrubs if you're growing them the other way, I guess. So don't worry about bud eyes for climbing roses. Shirley, do you have any climbing roses?
I have the Louis Philippe.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you have that. Okay, perfect. So let's quickly talk about some of the fungal pathogens and the problems that go ahead, Shirley.
Want to answer the questions about pruning before we moved on, or at the end?
Let's see.
We had one about taking off a third of it was under question and answer.
Yeah. Can you take more than 1/3 of height off of when pruning if you want roses smaller? Yes. So a lot of cases, we're not going to recommend it, but with a lot of our roses, it's totally fine. So
what I've found with the shrub roses is that they don't like to be drastically pruned. I had to prune one to move it, and it pouted for a year before it really started growing again. Mm-hmm. But if you have to, maintain the size, you've got to do something, because some of these guys will get really big.
Yeah, and if you're pruning it back to the same height every year, that makes it easier on the rose. In a substantial, doing a big cut on a rose for transplanting is actually what's recommended. But again, yeah, because then it's having to reestablish itself. There's a lot of things that it's going through at that point that makes it a little unhappy, but that's a good point.
There was another question about using jasmine as a mulch for roses.
So jasmine is good ground cover around mulches. Jasmine is a great ground cover. It's really easy to put in the landscape, very low maintenance, but nonetheless, being that it's a plant, it will try to compete against the roses in your landscape because it's looking for that moisture and those nutrients. So if you have the ability to keep your roses out from a jasmine or keep the jasmine away from the roses, your roses will thank you for it, because jasmine in plant beds, it's put in there to kind of help fill in a space. So it can begin to outcompete the other plants that are in that bed. So outside of trees, it doesn't impact trees, but other plants. So great question. So let's quickly talk about, because we're getting up to our time. So let's quickly talk about some of the troubleshooting of roses. So we have fungal pathogens, insects, and viruses. Fungal pathogens are those big ones. Those are going to be those are the biggies that impact our roses the most. So actually, if you're maintaining high-end roses, you're having to spray your roses on a monthly basis or every other week. No, not even a monthly. You're spraying them each week or every other week. You're spraying them all the time with different fungicides to keep the fungus from being able to grow on them. The low maintenance roses, you're not having to do that as much. But then, you're thinking about having to rotate your type of fungicides that you're using to prevent the fungus from sporulating and growing. So fungal pathogens are pretty problematic. So what about drenches? So soil drenches can be used for roses, but then same thing is the frequency that you're going to have to use them. You have to make sure that you're rotating fungicides, because if you don't rotate fungicides, you keep using the same type of fungicide, then what's going to happen is that fungus is going to develop a resistance and the fungicide will no longer work, or won't work as effectively. So you're having to change the type of fungicide that you're using or rotating its mode of action. So the powdery mildew, black spot, and Cercospora are big fungal pathogens. Black spot specifically, that is the one that will cause complete defoliation of your rose and it will kill your rose. Powdery mildew is really easy to manage, and Cercospora is easy to manage relatively, but by managing black spot, you're going to be managing powdery mildew and Cercospora. So the management doesn't necessarily change between them. It's just which one do you get. One, you're gonna have to be very proactive to fight against like black spot. And that's why we talked about removing the leaves and top dressing with a little bit of mulch, and getting all those leaves each season out of the landscape can really help. There we go. So some other pathogens that we can get, Botrytis blight, that's actually happening. That's a fungus that's happening on the flower buds themselves. And downy mildew, it's another type of fungus that we'll see on the leaves. A lot of these are pretty easy to control by just pruning them out of the shrubs, but the most common fungicide that homeowners can use that can be pretty effective for a lot of these is copper fungicides. Shirley, do you use any other specific fungicides for?
I don't use any.
Say that again, sorry.
I don't use any fungicides.
There we go. That's good. The power of the low maintenance. So copper fungicide are pretty simple and common and easy for homeowners to get and use. So for the rare times that you would have to use them, that can help with management, but typically just pruning out the infected spots as soon as you see them, and sanitizing your pruning shears, because you can spread fungus with your shears, no problem. By clipping them out, that's going to help maintain and prevent a lot of that fungus issues to occur. So can using weed barrier be harmful and promote fungus? So no. So actually the weed barrier can be pretty beneficial for obviously weed suppression, but a lot of that weed barrier can help, it still breathes. So the soil can still dry out just as quick. And that moisture has the ability to leave. It's unlike, if you're doing like solarization, where it's holding that moisture and trapping that heat in. Yeah, anything that you clip, put in a trash bag and just put it in your trash can. Don't compost it, because then you can end up bringing it back into your garden through the compost. Completely remove it from the garden. So crown gall, that's actually a bacteria. You'll see that happening in the crown of the roses. Usually just pruning those out can be a successful management. We do have chili thrips, which is actually an invasive insect species that can cause some wrinkling and some strange foliar deformations. So it's important just to monitor for those. A virus, which if you get it, you might just have to remove the rose, but it's a combination of different viruses, this rose mosaic. And you can identify it very clearly based off of this type of damage. But, sometimes it can be confused with whitefly damage, of course. So just proper identification can help lead to proper control and management. But the biggest thing with our pests is just follow best management practices. A lot of the issues that we have with roses relate to just cultural management, keeping water off of the leaves, make sure the water, any irrigation is on the root zone. That's going to be best. The more moisture you have on the leaves, the longer it sits on there, the higher chance you're going to end up with fungal pathogens within your garden. And then also sanitize. Anytime you're pruning anything, especially if you're pruning something that you're concerned about it, there being potential fungal pathogens, clean your loppers, your pruners, your hands, everything to help reduce the potential spread of that fungus to any of your other plants in the landscape. Because gardeners, humans, we're great vectors for every disease. We can easily spread a lot of our fungal pathogens, and completely unintentionally. So we do have a question that says, can rose pesticides harm pollinators? Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's why cultural management practices are going to be best, because if you have a strong, healthy rose, you're following cultural best management practices, there's going to be a substantial less likelihood that you do have issues of pest on any of your plants, not just your roses. So then from there, you're thinking of what's those mechanical control methods of just squishing bugs. That's always super helpful. Having other pollinators around really helps out, because that attracts a lot of beneficial insects and other wildlife to your landscape that can help naturally control those. And ladybugs are wonderful for aphid control. So you try to go through these different control methods in order to prevent pests from being a problem, where pesticides become a last-ditch effort. But if we follow best management practices, usually having to get to applied pesticides is very rare. And not just roses, but all plants. So only apply pesticides if there is a legitimate concern. So, and are Japanese beetles a problem in Florida? No, not like they are up north. So when I used to live in Ohio, you have Japanese beetle traps around the neighborhood in the middle of the summer, and they'd just be full, hundreds of them. But anyways, so now let's jump back into our essential questions. So we went through and we talked about which roses do best, those low maintenance varieties. And I'll send out that list. Obviously, we have a couple publications with the university that talk about the specific varieties that do well here. But we talked about those, and then we talked a lot about that management. So site selection, site preparation, planting, irrigation, fertilization, grooming, pruning, mulching. We talked all about stuff, and then pest management. So roses, there's a lot to do with them, but with starting out with that right plant in the right place, and then selecting the plants to do well here, you really reduce the amount of work and input that goes into maintaining your roses in your landscape. But we do know the tips and trips, like the grooming and the pruning, that can help make our roses look more spectacular, I guess, throughout the year as they're growing. So always feel free to reach out to our county extension office. I don't have my email on here. I need to add that, but I'll send you all an email. Nonetheless, but our main office is located out in Callahan, next to the fair board, or next to the fairgrounds. We have our Master Gardener help desk you can always reach out to. Oh, there's my email. Perfect. So always reach out to us. If you have any questions about roses or anything in your garden or anything horticulture related, our county extension office is here to help you all out. So we'll go ahead and we'll open up the floor to some questions.
Did you answer?
Oh, go ahead.
Did you answer the one about what to sanitize with?
So no. So usually an isopropyl alcohol will be effective. A bleach water solution works just as well. Usually I just have like a little container of bleach and water solution that I just dip my pruning shears into after my cuts. I just have out with me in the garden when I know I'm going to be having to deal with plants that have fungal pathogens. I'm going to make sure I have to sanitize. So wipes can work. I've used them in a pinch, but they just end up adding up over time, but it's rare that you use them, I guess, overall. Should you use fungicide only when you see a problem or as maintenance? So that's a very good question. Using a fungicide for high maintenance roses on a regular basis as part of maintenance is recommended. For low maintenance roses, no, only as needed. Only as needed. So usually, like I know Shirley mentioned she hasn't applied many of them, or rarely does. And those low maintenance roses, they do well without having to do it, but the high maintenance ones, you have to do it on a regular basis. But typically, if you can prune out the issues and remove the issues because they're isolated, that's going to be best. Changing cultural practices to help prevent fungal outbreaks, that's going to be even better. And then making sure that then if you have to really control them, there are methods that you can put down, like copper fungicides, et cetera, if it gets bad. So for the bleach water solution, I just use a typical, like a capful for a gallon of water. And that works out well. There are true recommendations, like to have this amount measurable, but a capful for a gallon, it works. So so the best method for transplanting and time to transplant, usually the best time to transplant is going to be in the kind of when roses are going through their dormant period, because that's when they're going to have the less stress. Usually you're going to be pruning them before that transplant. You don't have to, but pruning them can help out. But usually that dormant period, so the cool time of year, that's going to be the best time to prune back and then transplant into that new location. Oh yeah, I know. I haven't been there, but yeah, the Thomasville, Georgia has a big rose festival every year. My brother-in-law went to Thomasville for a while to school. He pitched for their baseball team. So should we add soil amendments in February? And if so, what do you use and how to apply it? So if you're starting over a bed or starting a new bed, go ahead and till in right before you do planting. If you're doing garden amendments now because you just need them, you can kind of apply them at any time. So some of the soil amendments can really depend on pH, you know, like compost in general is going to be good and effective. But if you have an alkaline soil, you know, maybe you're doing peat moss as your amendment because it can help reduce that pH and make it more acidic, which will be more preferred for those roses. So with that application, like when you're doing a soil prep, usually at 2 to 4 inches and then till it into the top 12 inches of the soil. If you're not, and you already have a landscape where you have established roses, you would just add, you would just top dress with some of the amendments. And if you could kind of till them in lightly to the top of the soil, that would work. But you can just top dressing can help, but you use minimal.
Taylor?
Yeah.
Going back to the wearing gloves, a hand surgeon told me that he does 2 or 3 surgeries a year because of garden punctures. And he did surgery on my hand from a rose thorn. And basically it got infected and I lost the joint. So wearing gloves, if you're working with anything, even if it doesn't have prickles or thorns, even a stem can poke you. So good gloves and good protection in the garden's pretty important.
Yeah. Gardening isn't a safe sport. The number of times I've been stung by wasps and bees and been poked and prodded by plants, just innumerable. But that's, so PPE or personal protection equipment is vital in the garden. You know, gloves, actually preferred gloves, long sleeve shirts. You know, of course, in Florida, if you're mowing your grass in the hot sun, you can wear t-shirts, but just sunscreen, hats, sunglasses, they all help out tremendously. So making sure that anything that time that you're working in the garden that you are wearing as personal protection equipment. And with roses, if you're working a lot of them, get gauntlets, get the long ones that go all the way up to your elbows. Your body will really thank you for those, because my hands are usually protected, no problem, because I'll wear thick leather gloves when I'm working with roses, but I don't have the gauntlets. So like when I worked at the botanical gardens, I didn't have gauntlets. So my forearms, despite having long sleeves, I would have scratches and pokes. I'd get prickles stuck in my shirt Yeah. So you just always have to be careful. All right. Well, thank you everybody very much for joining us today. Reach out to us at the Extension Office, reach out to the Master Gardener Volunteer Help Desk. We're here to help you with your gardening. And, this program was recorded, so we'll send it out to everybody that joined us today. And one of the most important things is with all of our programs, we send out a survey that we use to help make sure that we're monitoring and double checking that our program is doing well. Please take a few minutes to fill that out. That feedback is tremendous. It really helps us overall. The overall extension program, the Master Gardener Volunteers as part of their program development and planning. So please take a few minutes to fill that out. But anyways, thank you all so much. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll stay on for a couple more minutes if there's any questions.